morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many shiny faces this lovely May morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's discussion, or to moderate today's discussion on the occasion of the 6th Annual Great Rivers Biennial, which I will call GRB for short because that's how we talk about it behind the scenes here at CAM. I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists, and I'll go from stage left and stage right. So on stage right are exhibiting artists Brandon Anschultz, Carlie Trosclair, and Cayce Zavaglia. Hopefully by now you all have had a chance to experience their extraordinary exhibitions. And to your stage left are our distinguished jurors, Lowery Stokes Sims, the Charles Bronfman International Curator at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City. Lowery has been a leader in the museum field for over 40 years as both the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem before joining the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City in 2007. Her major exhibition, New Territories, Design, Craft, and Art from Latin America 2000 to 2013, opens at the museum this coming November. Next to Lowery, on Lowery's left, is artist Mel Chin, whose long and storied practice is steeped in conceptual ideas as well as issues of social justice. We are thrilled to present his acclaimed retrospective Rematch, which was organized by the New Orleans Museum of Art here at CAM this fall, directly following our summer exhibitions. And to my right is Lynn Warren, and I welcome her to our panel. Lynn is a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, where she has been organizing exhibitions, many with an emphasis on Chicago artist histories, drawing, and archival materials, often from the MCA's own vast collection since 1980. Among her many important shows are Jim Nutt, Coming into Character, Alexander Calder, Form, Balance, Joy, H.C. Westerman, Robert Heineken, Photographist, a 35-year retrospective, and Art in Chicago 1945 to 1995. It's tremendous to have the three of you here with us today to actually have a chance to speak to our artists about their projects and the process that informed their work. So welcome to all of you. We are so pleased to have all of you here with us today. And now, just a little bit about Great Rivers and the jury process itself. So while the history of Great Rivers is nearly as long as CAM's, having been launched the year after our building opened in 2004, this weekend marks the first time that our jurors have returned to St. Louis to see the outcomes of these exhibitions, of their artist selections. This is a testament not only to the strength of the artist's work, but also to the commitment of our jurors, who were invited specifically for their expertise and prominence in the field. And as you know, the jury changes with each edition of the biennial, and the resulting exhibition is a direct reflection of the thought and care that went into the jury process itself. And before we get started, I just want to thank my colleagues, specifically Registrar David Smith and the rest of CAM staff and installation crew for all of their hard work preparing for this exhibition. And I also reiterate Lisa's thank you to the Gateway Foundation for their continued commitment in making this exhibition possible every other summer. So thanks to all of you. So with all of that said, let's get started. And my first question is for all of you, actually. With each iteration of the biennial, commonalities and various themes emerge across your three bodies of work, and the newest version that just launched last night continues this thread. And what I immediately observed about this biennial specifically, and one thing that connects Brandon's, Carlie's, and Cayce's works to each other, is a serious attention not only to craft and the handmade, but also an emphasis on both trial and error and play and experimentation in the studio. And I see all three of your projects in part as a result of testing out ideas in the studio or out in the world as well, with Brandon's work in terms of form, color, structure, and now narrative. Cayce in terms of the process by which a portrait gets made, whether in textiles or in paint, and Carlie in how you experiment with space and architectural dimensions. So I was hoping each of you could discuss your projects and what role craft and the handmade, as well as experimentation, play in your work. Brandon, will you please start us off?
Sure.
We'll move inwards.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
The work that I'm presenting is coming out of about a 3-year direction studying paint as sort of sculpture. And I think the trial and error part of it falls within the sculptural objects themselves, the sort of 15 or so objects made of paint that are in the show. And where strategy for me comes into play as kind of the other side of that coin was designing specifically for this exhibition and sort of how I was going to scale up from these sort of handheld size objects and use the space in what I could see as the most interesting way. So as far as trial and error, probably for any single thing out there, I've got 10 failures in the studio or 10 other versions of it. And you guys saw how much stuff I brought in to test. I sort of brought half of my studio here, and they generously let me move stuff around and trip over stuff for a couple of days. Yeah, does that address?
Yeah, I think especially with your practice, it seems like it's very much, in terms of your objects, thinking about, how many times do you have to dip them? We talked a lot in the process of, at the opening last night about how they change over time, even after they're finished, and how you've kind of learned from just repeatedly trying to make these things.
Well, I can say pretty quickly that through this sort of couple of years of this body of work, I've gotten more strategic. Initially, they were a lot of trial and error, and over the last year, sort of the finished product of what you see here, the sculptural objects themselves were pretty strategically made. I start really knowing kind of what's going to happen and set it up for that. I make notes on the objects to sort of give myself clues about scale, color trajectory, and what the final sort of iteration is going to be. If it's going to be something that's cut apart, if it's going to be something that's generatively into a new something a little bit later. So it's definitely more strategic than it has been.
Great, thanks. Carlie?
Good morning. This question's really interesting for me because I haven't actually had a real studio practice until this past January. So for the past 4 years, I've been making mostly on-site, kind of knowing what my materials would be, having a general idea of composition, and then really just fleshing it out on site. And this project was really challenging for me because the last 2 years I've been predominantly working within abandoned spaces, so whether that means photographing and then later manipulating the images or doing site-specific work within abandoned spaces, cutting through wallpaper, layers of plaster, things like that, or even two-dimensional work that was inspired from spaces. But because of the scale of this project, I really had to start thinking about not only how to plan for, but also taking, being in an abandoned space and what that means about place and the context of that environment and how that's going to transition into the museum. So, since January, just thinking about juxtaposing the museum within this history and how that kind of plays back and forth. And photography actually plays a really large part in my practice now because I take a lot of photographs when I'm exploring in abandoned spaces and kind of just manipulate the photos to create new compositions and new perspectives. And that starts to trigger off ideas for installations. So the piece that you see with the crack came from a photo mirror flip that I did of a break in a wall in an abandoned space. And that just kind of started me thinking about the composition within the museum. So this has definitely been a new kind of leaf for how I think about my practice, and then just really exploring ways to make things look old or patterns. It's really nice when you go into an abandoned space because all the decisions about design and aesthetic have been made with the patterns of the wallpaper and the breakdown. So that was, I think, my biggest experimentation in the studio, was working through restaging and recreating these spaces.
Cayce?
So I've been working on these embroideries for about 12 to 13 years, and I think they naturally have a craft sensibility to them. And so as I've worked on those over the years, and then I, for this exhibition, decided to do the gouache paintings of the backs of my images, of the embroideries, and then the very last thing I did were the very large format paintings. That was where I felt like with the most experimentation happened with my work and trial and error. I've always loved craft. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I could get my craft on like really quickly. So I have to resist the urge to, I have to have restraint in my artwork to not put too much craft. But I love the sense of the handmade, and I like that feeling, even like Carlie said, with the old and history, and I feel like there's this comfort in things that are handmade, in your memory. So my work has always been about the process, and I want you to be intrigued with the process and the portrait that I'm presenting to you, which is always friends and family. And so when I had the idea to do the big paintings, and I was stepping into kind of Chuck Close's domain of the 5x7, which was kind of intimidating, and it was a portrait. But for me, the trial and error, I just had to do it. I kind of started, I thought I knew which way to go, but I hadn't painted in a long time. I lost my way, and I had to find my way again and kind of fall in love with just the act of painting. But in the end, I enjoyed the trial and error and trying different techniques and spray painting and scraping and sanding, because that felt very hands-on. But I thought maybe I had lost that wonder of how the piece is constructed, and I just always want the portrait and the process to be equally interesting. And then Kelly came for her last studio visit and said, "Can I touch it? Like, can I run my hands all over it?" And I thought, well, I've done it. If she wants to just rub all over it, so.
Did I say that?
You did.
Could I say something?
Yeah, of course, Mel. Please chime in.
Well, rather than the craft, I'm grateful to look at the work, and I was thinking more of the psychological implications of what I was observing. You have this incredible novel, film, or short story actually, Suddenly Last Summer, and all the masking and all the layers that go into that great work by Tennessee Williams and the screenplay by Gore Vidal. And so I'm starting to look at that. Now I'm really grateful to see what it revealed in your work. And it's what it conveys about a place. And then you look at Carlie's also, it's like this uncovering, the scarification. I mean, these choices are not made. I mean, I'm interested in the psychological choices that we don't always know, you know? Even your nice, crafted, beautiful embroidery and this almost S&M-ish kind of binding that was revealed in your paintings. I mean, I'm more intrigued by the psychology. I feel like if it's a biennial, it's conveying this things that are not said, and things that are on the reverse, and things that are within any kind of Midwestern gateway city. It's a kind of an unusual presentation, and it is cohesive from that level. That's why I was happy to see it, that you have something that I was really hoping to see, because I was choosing, on my part, I was looking at very idiosyncratic work that had, I didn't know what the hell you're going to do. You know? And, but I think it's revealing. I would never imagine Williams' presentation coming in this way. See, so, but I can understand it, and so that's the other level. Rather, even though we can look at the craft of things, and so what does it say, and what is three pieces where you like them or not, you know, say as a cohesive standard, you know. So anyway, I just want to throw that in, just because, you know, I've had some coffee.
Yeah, Lowery, Lynn, do you have anything else
Yeah,
you'd like to add to
actually,
that? Yeah.
It didn't occur to me when we were looking at all the work and selecting the three finalists here, how craft-based many of their processes were. It was more of, I think for me anyway, a very instinctive, I was connecting with the artist somehow through their presentations. And for those of you who've never done a blind jury, it's a process of seeing a lot of work, and you can just get sort of, oh my gosh, not another, you know, current hip idea iteration that seems soulless. But in the case of these three artists, I really felt like I was connecting with them on a very, like you used that word, idiosyncratic, on a very personal idiosyncratic level where they were using contemporary art tools but not slavishly selling out to whatever the notion of correct international practice is these days. And for me, being in Chicago for so many years and being somewhat of an expert on the so-called Imagist school, particularly through scholarship with Jim Nutt and others, who when they emerged in their careers were just excoriated for their craft and somehow put aside as, well, they're not real artists because there's too much care taken in building their images. So it's also interesting for me to see this perennial question, like you said, you ever since you were a kid, you could just get your craft on. You kind of have to pull back from that. And yes, it is a balancing act, but I'd be particularly interested in hearing what Lowery has to say about this sort of craft issue, given her current show that's going to come up in November.
When I started at MAD 7 years ago, I had been working mostly in the sort of, I guess you call it the fine art context, so I call it the dark side of the art world. And then I came to MAD where, craft and design has, I was doing all this reading and the moral imperative of craft, and I said, oh my God, I don't know if I'm worthy, to sort of be here. But it was an interesting because, I never thought that I would get a chance to become a recovering curator after being a director. So and MAD was like the last place I thought I'd get a job. So when I got there, I had to sort of really figure out what I was going to do and what was going to interest me, and what were my capabilities of. So for me, it was really, I think, drawing on a lot of past experiences, which I think allowed me to get the job, being involved with the feminist art movement, being involved with artists of color, how do you want to say, people coming who are like African, Asian, Native American, Latino, in the 70s and 80s, where there was this kind of interest in reaching into cultural reservoirs, for their art. It became sort of, really smooshed under postmodernism. But for me, it was the personal relationship to one's family and the values that making had within those cultures that was really very interesting, that sort of really prepared me to sort of step into MAD. And then, after 6 years of, just doing fundraising and governance, to go down into Chelsea and to see all this handwork and making in sort of, what would be fine art context was really kind of interesting for me. And I think that, when you talk about getting involved in the craft and pulling back, it's for me, it was the other opposite way of sort of being so Warholian that you would just deal with concept and not execution, that you have to sort of like really find your balance. So when I got to MAD, the museum had rebranded itself from the American Craft Museum to the Museum for Arts and Design. From my point of view, I don't know if the trustees would sort of agree with me, it was clear that they had to, because craft in and of itself, while, like certainly a viable, way, in terms of the art world, from the New York perspective, was not having, attracting a younger sort of support staff. So we were running out of, patrons, supporters, and potential trustees. But I think that Holly Hotchner and David McFadden, who succeeded me as the chief curator at MAD, really understood and sort of tapped into a reservoir of artists who are like they're now sort of, populating, the fine art world. But there's like this, like this kind of huge community of artists internationally, who I call the anal retentive obsessive making artists, who we seem to specialize in, but who are really filled with wonder about the potentiality of materials, the potentiality of the hand and sort of making. So for me, I've sort of formulated this whole kind of way I do my practice that really sort of embraces this whole notion of process and materials as a way to jump over all the politics about using the word craft with a small c or a big C, and sort of making these kinds of divisions, because in doing this particular exhibition in Latin America, I don't think I found anything that wasn't stuff that I find in New York or when I did the Global Africa show, that designers are now working more with bespoke ways, not sort of mass production, that craft people are calling themselves artists. They're sort of really questioning the utility of forms and making us question, this vase that has holes in it, which means it leaks, so it doesn't work. And artists who are sort of really becoming involved, like in materials. So for me, it's very clear when we were looking at the slides that, your work sort of rose, to the top of, the group for me. Not to say that I wasn't, as a New Yorker, I have to always be put in my place constantly that there is art in other places besides New York, and that most of the art in New York comes from other places. So I'm always love to sort of take gigs like this where I can sort of really get a sense of, what's going on. And yes, there is a way that young artists are, have access to this kind of international vocabulary that you sort of see that makes a piece from Lebanon totally indistinguishable from a piece from New Delhi. But I like when you sort of hunker down and sort of, deal with your own experiences, what comes out of your day-to-day, living, and what kinds of things really inspire you. So I guess in a way I wasn't really surprised that, you ended up on the top of the heap, because I think that in many ways, all three of you really indicate the future of what's happening in the art world. No matter how, you're always going to have, a certain generation of male artists who, are very adherent to Greenbergian ideas, and they have modern art over here and kitsch over here, and for them, kitsch is anything that's not, cerebral and thought and, engages you and has hand and has material and has texture and has presence off the wall. So I think that, right here in St. Louis, you have the sort of indication of where the art world, I think, is increasingly going. Congratulations.
I'm a male artist, MEL artist. I live in Egypt Township.
I said certain male artists, not the
Oh, I'm
specific
sorry.
male
Oh,
artists.
I'm sorry. Okay, my bad.
I wish you'd listen.
Yeah, but it's almost like practicing a Malcolm. I'm a conceptualist that I look to as a way of masking or formalizing political thought or ideas, and so it's like a Malcolm XXX, by any means, madness, material necessary to accomplish the concept. And I see it in all your work. I think it doesn't always, and I think what I'm still interested in this other layers of what, it's not that you're always aware of, I'll speak for myself, about the surrounding world. In fact, you can, as an artist, I can become quite delusional about my aspirations. And I guess if you do this kind of work, eventually you might find the epiphany that establishes its presence and makes you understand where it really was coming from. And you may be, in our work, we may be evoking a climate that is around us, whether a fascination with, almost decay, or even looking at the restraint that craft can put upon you, and this advancement toward liberation that will eventually become your entrapment. So anyway, I just see it's kind of curious to come here and look at the work and be grateful that there's some kind of judgment that rendered it not to be too shabby, So, y'all like it okay?
Can I ask a question? I'm curious about the artists themselves. I mean, how do you see yourselves? You're here in St. Louis, there's the big art worlds, other places. I mean, how do you see your work? I mean, what kind of aspirations do you have for your work?
That's a complicated question and a complicated answer probably. I've been out of sort of school for the last 10, 12 years and made a conscious decision to stay here and not to move to New York or not to move to LA, where it would have been maybe easier to, maybe not easier to, have a career, whatever that means. And I personally made that decision sort of for personal and pragmatic reasons. I wanted to be in a place where I could be pretty instantly part of a community, have a pretty fantastic studio, not have to have 15 jobs, and have an actual life. But I don't know if that's what was the question? We were talking about aspirations.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Or how
I don't know if I get it. Yeah.
situating yourself and committing to being an artist in St. Louis, how
Yeah.
that impacts your practice, how that
Well, it impacts
affects
it
how you
hugely.
see your work, yourself, and so on.
Yeah, I think it impacts it hugely. You know, I mean, I've been lucky enough, I don't know if that's right, to show a little bit around here and there, and not just in St. Louis. But it's hard. You know, I mean, there's 50,000 other artists that are right there, and we're not right there. So you know, it's easy to not be the first choice for stuff, or fall into sort of that. But on the flip side of it, it's kind of nice to be in a small community. It's kind of nice to have.
Well, I was just going to address that because I actually grew up outside St. Louis many years ago in the sticks, really. Pacific, Missouri, do you all know where that is? And there was nothing going on here, and I hadn't come back to really participate in any of the art for years and years until maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and I was invited by the Sam Fox School to come and do graduate critiques. And I was just really astounded how much of a community I found, and it was vital, and the teachers were engaged, and the students were doing good work, and I was just sort of like, whoa. So when I was asked back here to do this juror, I discovered more of that community. We got to know Kelly a little bit, and I was really impressed because, sort of to reflect what you're saying, I feel like the most vital art right now is coming out of real communities, not these internet communities that are constructed and we're supposed to think are better because somehow they're more contemporary using this technology. But those real human-to-human communities that are taking place in maybe not what are considered the traditional mainstreams of art. So that really hooked me in, and I'm proselytizing now in that.
Good.
Hey,
We need that.
I grew up in St. Louis. It was great. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But
No,
I wanted
I-
to support what you were saying.
Yeah, I think we have to give ourselves a certain amount of pep talk every once in a while. That people come through, and there are sometimes great conversations that can happen, but I think that sometimes we're not seen as real artists because we're not in New York and not in LA and not in Berlin or wherever. But at the same time, again, like what you said, there's something to be said about community, and there's something to be said about working in a place where you can get some interesting things done. I mean, I've gotten to be part of some pretty fantastic things here. Whether that be a startup space, whether that be working on an artist project, whatever. So it's a balance.
And you get so much more time in the studio.
Absolutely.
Well, I just want to piggyback on what Brandon's saying. I was having a conversation last night with someone just about the difference between LA and St. Louis, and they had spent time in both cities, and just talking about how in St. Louis you don't have to worry about climbing any social ladders necessarily. And if you want something done, you can actually just do it. And people are generally really supportive, and that to me really influences, I guess, the psychology behind my studio practice. I get more time to kind of just have, I don't know, just really put myself in my studio practice, not have to worry about having 15 jobs. I mean, I think I learned and chose specifically to stay here as well, because I was learning from other people, really struggling and having a lot of jobs, and I'm always on the run, and I don't have time to make my work, and it's well, I want to make work. So I'm going to be in a place where I can afford to make work and focus on that practice. So
I think too, I feel like if you're in New York, it happens more organically. You're all crammed in these little studio spaces. Someone will come to see their studio work. It might happen to see you. It kind of can happen like that. But I also feel like with the internet, I can find out what's happening elsewhere if I'm interested, but in a way, it keeps me more in my studio because I'm already there making work alone. And then because I can access it on the computer, I don't know if that's healthy, that it's keeping me, not out there. But for me, I know one of the most interesting things, it was really before the internet took off, was I got this idea to start sewing portraits. And, said to my husband, I'm thinking about, switching it up, sewing. And he was like, that's disgusting. And I was like, well, I'm going to try it. And he was like, it's gross. And so I did one, and I kind of thought where it could go to the next one. And then a couple years later, when the internet was really, people were blogging, and you could see what other people were making, or just looking at shows, like the Pricked show,
Pricked and Radical Lace and
right, and
string
then
knitting.
you look at when they started making their work,
Right.
and I thought, what was happening at that time when the internet hadn't really taken off, that everyone was kind of, and that to me was very interesting, and I still think about that now as far as trends you'll see in artwork, or even like the color palette with Brandon and I's work is, I said, your sculpture could totally be in front of my painting, and he did steal hot pink from me. Like, he didn't do a studio visit. I had it first, but we won't get into that today. No. But I find that very interesting. Like, we had actually, none of us had met, well, I hadn't met them before this exhibition, and I found that so interesting. What is happening that, he would choose that color palette and I would choose that color palette. And so those kind of things, I think, I like to think back on.
Right.
as my work
Just to put it in
goes on.
perspective, I grew up in New York City in Queens in the 1950s and 60s, which was tantamount to growing up in St. Louis, okay, as far as the art world was concerned. And I remember in 1976, when I was at the Met a couple of years, the Queens Museum asked me to jury a show called the Queens Annual. And me being ignorant said, there are artists in Queens. Oh, cool. And we, sort of did it, and that was people's reactions. Now, the sort of, invasion, and sort of movement of the aura out from Manhattan to, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island is like really phenomenal. It's still, nascent, but it's really there. So I think that, who knows, the aura could sort of get to St. Louis, very, very, very quickly. And I think that, the Fate on Books has just put out a publication called Art Cities of the Future. And it's places you never even heard of. But they point to the role of institutions, patrons, and, key individuals who are going to be activists, in sort of like supporting artists as a way that they evaluated these as cities of the future. So I think that there is no look at Detroit. It's going under, but now it's considered a hot city, and why, so there are many different ways in which, I think that, cities become sort of like these kinds of laboratories for advancement that, of artists that I think is really important. Sorry.
Oh, I get sent Art Forum, even though I don't subscribe to it. I just brought it down to read. It was spending a few minutes right before this panel, and this caught my eye. I actually tore it out of the magazine. I miss my pre-internet brain. So it's like what you were just talking about. There's a piece by Douglas Coupland, Coupland, in a series of 100 slogans for the 21st century. So it's just kind of interesting, that we're kind of talking about pre-internet, current internet, and then things like actual development of art communities in real cities, not just virtual connections.
Well, there's a lot of things we're going on the presumption of the term art world, and of course all the dialectics and the commercial aspects are being conducted more or less in New York, of high end, so to speak. And I understand nothing against that, but maybe if that's the only definition, then perhaps we have a lot to aspire to here in St. Louis or any other city, but it's not. And I think that, and then this whole conversation about cities and how they can be saved by art, and this kind of rabid kind of belief from certain people that art can be an economic driver. I don't want to resemble that remark, as an artist. I'm talking artist to artist, and how our obligation is to begin this challenge to things and create options that didn't exist before, So it's almost like when we get involved, I'm in the middle of the internet. When I think in the 90s, we were doing this project on primetime television. I thought fax was it, man. Fax was like so wild. We were saying fax is back and forth from Los Angeles, and I thought that was like, if somebody mentioned email, I said, get out of here. What are you talking about? it's in constant evolution and transformation, but if I think we're talking about ideas and where we fit into it, then in some respects, a lot of the work you see in a lot of cities resembles work that you would see eventually in some gallery in New York. It's not that different. And so the question is basically how these connections within your own community or beyond. It can be this imaginary community you discovered, and then that creates a certain kind of mindset that offers something wholly original to the conversation. You know, I think it's a big challenge. I think we're saturated with the capacity to get connected. You know, you know. I said we don't have high-speed internet nor cell service where I live in Egypt Township. We're working on that. So I was working on dial-up, doing films from Santiago, Chile, and I remember a 3-second transmission of animation would take an entire day.
Fine.
So, but
This is in western North Carolina.
yeah, thank you
That's
very
where
much.
Egypt Township is.
Yeah, but you know, I think the larger, if we're talking about art and ideas, I mean, because that's where still all three of you are composed of ideas that you have assumed responsibility for. And I'm really interested in how things evolve and develop and mutate more than how they stay the same. Because then the idea of branding, of you being a specific type of artist, to me, that terrifies me, you know. And so it's good to see stages of evolution in all of you.
Yeah, and I actually just wanted to say, given the current international model of places like this and many other smaller cities around the United States, bringing in your sort of big name international artists and giving them residencies and offering them to do some site-specific work. I mean, I've sort of had it up to here with seeing some of these people on this international circuit go in and be in a place for 2 weeks and think that they're somehow coming up with something relevant to the community. And I really congratulate Cam for doing the opposite, taking the artists that are here and giving them a real opportunity to bump their art up to the next level and giving some real cash behind this, not just, oh, wow, this is a great honor, but yeah, you guys need some money, so here. And again, it was great to come back and really see that the artist had stepped up to the plate and done some real great installations of their work, of the ideas that they had presented, because again, for those of you not familiar with the jury process, these artists presented some actual works, but they also presented their idea for what they would do if they did get this honor of being in the Great Rivers.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty of the process and the practicalities of making new work for this exhibition. So each of you had about 7 months to complete your projects after you were selected. And originally, as Lynn mentioned, you submitted specific proposals for what you intended to create were you to be selected for the award. Yet each of your projects evolved very much in the process, and you each faced different challenges. So I was hoping you could please share with us how each of you came to your finished projects and also what it was like to make work specifically for this exhibition. So take us behind the scenes a little bit.
Shall I? When I presented the proposal for this, I knew that I wanted to use this idea of the play and film Suddenly Last Summer as a jumping off point for how I was gonna kind of code the work in this space and how I was gonna sort of build to suit in here. And when we discovered where we were gonna sort of be in the museum, I started thinking about you know, kind of the logistics of the spaces. And I was really happy to get Gallery A in the front there. And as soon as I found out we could open the windows up and have it be sort of open on Spring Street. And it's not really been for the last year or so. It's been closed for the last year or two?
Since last fall.
Okay. And you know, I've spent a lot of time in this building and a lot of time in the galleries, and wanted to really sort of turn my work up specifically in there. And I thought really, really strategically about placement and about scale and about volume and about sort of how that gallery operates, because it's sort of an aggressive space. You know, a lot of the spaces in this building are architecturally kind of difficult for some work. And, you know, the walls are, topped with a mirror, or topped with windows, and again, they're just sort of aggressive volumes. So I wanted to really address that and sort of recede away from the walls and rely on color and rely on scale and rely on sort of movement within that space to really specify the project that I had proposed and sort of harken back to this beginning narrative that I used as a jumping off point from this play, which sort of centers around a character that's not there and in sort of a prehistoric garden. So I used those ideas to sort of code the scale and the strategy that I used in that direction.
Any major challenges that you want to share with us?
Time was just the challenge. I mean, 7 months is, it's a great honor, and having the money was absolutely fantastic. 7 months to do this was really kind of hard to pull off, but I just had to build that into the strategy and figure out a way to make things modular and have it set up in a way to where I pretty much knew what was going to happen, but give myself enough flexibility built in to get in the space and make it do what I wanted it to do.
Carlie?
As I mentioned before, I hadn't really taken this new body of work that I was doing in abandoned spaces into a museum or gallery setting before. So I think that was my biggest challenge of thinking about how I was going to tell the story in the context of the museum. And my proposal was more separate. It was about abandoned spaces, and it was about recreating these situations and scenarios, but it was more freestanding, and that didn't feel appropriate. So around January, I kind of would come Gallery B, walk down the stairs, walk in the nook of the way the space was laid out for the previous show, and just really think about viewer experience, think about architecture is incredibly important for my work. So just thinking about how to activate the space appropriately and still talk about the concept and ideas that I was interested in currently within my studio practice. And it was very, it wasn't until about 2 months ago that I realized that I kept hitting a wall about restaging an abandoned space without it being integrated into the museum walls somehow. And I think that was a really, light bulb go off kind of moment, not fighting against the clean space, but embracing it. And that's why you see kind of the timeline of a narrative of the, clean white wall of the institution and the museum. And then it's excavating back these layers. So if we broke down kind of the history, just creating this fictional narrative of spaces that I am inspired by. So I think that was the biggest challenge, is translating those spaces that are elsewhere. How is it going to relate within the museum? What is that experience like? What is the narrative of that story?
And yours is very much about construction too, what are the limitations and the possibilities for what we can do in this building for your work. Yeah. And Cayce?
So, like I said, I've been doing these embroideries for about 12 or 13 years, and when I proposed for the biennial, I proposed a series of large format paintings of the backs of my embroideries. I was trained as a painter, and I wanted to return to paint, but in a very purposeful way. I had always painted on the backgrounds, which are built up in layers, acrylic, and kind of sanded down before I start the embroideries. So when I kind of discovered this reverse image a couple years ago, I felt like it was a perfect way to return to paint, because I never really wanted to paint a portrait. I had kind of 13 years under my belt of teaching myself embroidery, and kind of each piece would inform the next as far as technique with those, and I felt very confident in that. So my initial proposal was for a whole gallery filled with those large format paintings, and then after I wrote up my whole proposal, I saw the word optional, and I thought, I've edited that thing, and I was just afraid maybe that locks me in. What if I change my mind and I won't win anyway? So then when I won, and Lisa called me, and then I told my mom, and I cried, and I think, and then you're given this money, and you really feel like, oh my gosh, I can do anything I've ever wanted to. Like, yeah, I don't have to do that. And then you freak out, and then you settle down, and I just felt like Tim Gunn was on my shoulder, like, you got to edit, you got to make it work, and so I came down from that, and I really did want to do the big pieces, but I'm relatively unknown in St. Louis, and I felt if I just show those, it's not going to tell the whole story of how I arrived at those, and would tell a more complete story with the embroideries. And I've always wanted my work to appeal to a vast amount of people, or a vast variety of people. So there's people who love portraiture and would like that. There's people who do not like, they would actually, the more abstracted image is more normal, I think, even for our eye to see these days, and really appreciated the complexity of that. So as far as the challenge for me in making those pieces was, I wanted to do 3. And then, like I said, I started out, I kind of lost my way. There was a fun learning curve with those pieces. And I also had both pieces crammed right next to each other on one wall in my studio, so it was the wrong light, and a lot of, I don't know, they just looked totally different once they were in here, but I felt they were a fun challenge to make, and yeah, I was really happy to have the 2 together. For a long time, or several years, I've been thinking about this other side to us that we all have. Like, some people never see it, some people want to keep it hidden, some people have a lot of hurt, things have happened, a lot of scars, and we kind of put up a barrier. And so it wasn't so much making an opinion about that, it was pretty much like we can all relate to that. So I think when you get kind of what I'm doing, I'm more just putting it on the table, and then when you get it, it's like can hit something where, oh, okay, and it has that personal connection. But I don't so much want to talk about that because I think it's different for every one of us. So it's more just turning that piece around and putting it on the table for discussion.
Like a proposition in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, jurors, I want to ask the flip side of this question, and then we'll open up to the audience for your questions. So for each of you, how do these realized exhibitions open up your understanding or your kind of conception of these artists' practice based on what you saw 9 months ago?
Should I start?
Go ahead.
Well, I have a confession to make. I forgot what I saw a couple of months ago. I had to go on everybody's website and remind myself because I've like seen so much. I think that the one that surprised me most was the painting. The painting coming from the embroidery. I mean, I thought that was like really incredible. Just in terms of the concept, and I'm still trying to figure out without, sort of interrogating you how you built up that image, where you started from and, where you came. In terms of the installations with the walls, it just blows my mind how you sort of went back, created a back, the sort of inner wall, then put the beams on top of it, and then cut through the wall in what it seems like such a fluid way. And when you look at it, you know that it's totally constructed because things do not decay in such a wonderfully rhythmic, fluid kind of way. And I love the idea of cutting out the stencil and just letting it kind of like fly. Oh, it just drives me crazy. And then, Brandon, in terms of your work, I was really interested in the architectural, solution in terms of it, because I think that it could be such a fetishistic, experience of the work. And that would have been one thing, like sort of looking at these kind of fake geodes of, kind of a life and a process. But I think there's something about the architectural structures that you put it in that make it into a narrative, make it into a kind of almost open-ended cabinet of curiosities where you sort of, at different angles, sort of, discover different things about it. So, yeah, I really sort of enjoyed, the solutions, and I've really enjoyed your talking about, how you sort of grappled with, $20,000 in 7 months. but it could have been that show. Did you ever see that work? A work of art. We had to do it in one. Yeah. So consider yourself lucky.
I'm gonna try to finish something in 7 months myself, so I'm in the same shoes. So y'all can look at what I come up with and critique it, whatever. But anyway, just looking at what was that, it was more important for me that the work that would come out, it would, sometimes, I think it's more important for a work to create the desire to want to know what it's about. And that's what I felt that some of these presentations accomplished. That was more, because, who knows, And I like how you're mentioning how you just want to lay it on the table, because I think it's inherent in that's kind of presentation of this reverse. You're just taking it, you're inspired by something that physically is there, but there's a reason those choices are being made. And instead of like tackling a work and making a work, I think there's a transformation of a space that's important to what you've done. So again, all the pieces I think came out to a certain level to reanimate. I always say probably the greatest purpose of some work is to reanimate desire even to look at things again. You're in competition with a lot of stuff. So if it satisfies that, then that's not the worst place to be.
Well, and I feel like too, when you win something like this, there's all this pressure. Like, I don't know if they felt it. It's like, this has to be like the best that I've ever done. And then I realized it isn't. It's just an opportunity to show where I am right now. Because I find it interesting, just artists that I like to, I followed their work in undergrad, and then their work changes just like our work changes, and it's interesting, that journey. So for me, I feel like it's just a great opportunity to just spotlight where we are right now in our process.
Yeah, I found it really interesting how well I actually remembered your work, because I tend to go completely blank after seeing so much, and like Mel says, we're just bombarded with so much imagery, and keeping it all straight and focusing on it can be very taxing. But I was particularly interested in your installation, how it would be translated, because the word garden is in there, and I've seen a lot of art recently. It seems a sort of hip thing to do, where these sort of installations, and they put live plants in there. I mean, Rasheed Johnson's show, I love Rasheed. That show actually was organized by the MCA. It traveled here to the Kemper, so maybe some of you saw it. Involved putting some live plants in, and it's just kind of the hip thing to do. So I was actually a little afraid I was going to walk in, there'd be live plants. No. But I really feel the formal essence of what you've done, and I was actually kind of surprised by the glass and the reflective surfaces. That took me a little by surprise in trying to imagine what you might come up with. But I did very much feel, coming in and seeing what you've accomplished, that there was a very deep process of your own integrity of trying to understand how this would work best for you without making it, like someone said, fetishistic, because those dip things can be very, very sexy and can be very, fetishistic. You just gravitate right to them. So that was, for me, really nice to see. And with the Bill, I was very aware, Carlie, with your work that you went to existing places, and having grown up when I did, and many of those places were my childhood, where we were always taking off the layers from the outside and finding straw with mud between the logs. That's the kind of environment that you can find around here still too in some of the old farmhouses. So I was interested to know what you would do with taking something and building it into the museum. Obviously you had to do that. If maybe, I actually even had a little moment where, maybe she'll just like videotape it all and project it. No. So it was good to see how you came up with it, and that vinyl wallpaper wall with everything hanging, boy, that really knocked my socks off too. And I'm very interested in that part of what you did. And then Cayce, I mentioned to you earlier that I actually do a little handwork myself and was always interested in the back sides. But very curious to see how it would be translated. And I was a little afraid, you know, that it would come in and just be so decorative and kind of silly or whatever. Because I think we've all seen, especially maybe during the 60s, there was this sort of movement of doing portraiture, but just sort of splatting lines out from the faces in this completely arbitrary way that made it look hip and dynamic. And there's some of that going on, but it's because the threads actually go that way. And then, you know, Mel mentioned the sort of S&M bondage kind of aspect of cut, you know, the black threads that just come across the forehead of the one because she's got sort of dark brows that are very straight. All that becomes very accentuated when you see the work in person as opposed to imagining what you might do as the artist. So I was very pleased to see how you'd all translated what you had proposed into actual works in the museum.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lynn. And so now let's open it up to our audience. Does anyone have questions for our artists and jurors? Denise. Did everyone hear that? Yeah, about next steps.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I'm sort of always thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow in the studio, or I'm hesitant to even say. I don't know. I like to give myself problems and to switch gears kind of often. So this is, you know, a nice punctuation point in my brain to maybe try something a little bit different, still sort of in the same family of an idea. I kind of got these costumes in my mind for something. I'm a big fan of an artist, a Brazilian artist, Leo Orticica, who I've really enjoyed following his career and following what his trajectory was. And mine's kind of naturally mimicked that in a way. And in the 70s, he made all these like capes and costumes and stuff. And I don't know, I've kind of got the desire to maybe try some weird stuff like that maybe never gets shown to anybody. I don't know. I'm gonna play around this summer and not have a goal and just sort of find some stuff in the studio to make some weird stuff out of. I don't know.
Implicit in that question is follow-up has this 7 months helped you reach this next level?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think every exhibition every opportunity you get, you know, helps turn that knob and helps sort of define what comes next. I mean, I always learn something from everything that I get to do. You know, like this work here, you know, grew pretty directly out of 2 shows 2 and 3 years ago, where my work made a kind of a big transition. So yeah, this will definitely affect stuff for me. I'm not sure what yet.
My next step is to scale down. Well, I mean, I've made large-scale work for a long time, and I'm really interested, too, in getting my work to be more mobile and not always have to. This was really great because I already live here, but just always traveling and doing site-specific work. And while I enjoy it, I'm really interested in small nuances that I discovered while kind of preparing this show that I even had talked to Kelly in the earlier months about having sculptural objects presented, and it just didn't fit with the flow of the other large-scale installations, and it felt cluttered. But I'm interested in kind of looking at these materials on a smaller scale, potentially, and just kind of and see what happens. And a lot of playing around in the studio. I'm really excited to just work this summer. And keep expanding on materials. But yeah, I mean, I think everything definitely builds off of one thing or the next, and it's not like, oh, now after this show I have like this specific. I mean, I think it's just a more step-by-step evolutionary process of like working on the next idea, and shows feel like kind of just magnifying glass of like the moment where you're at in this kind of lifelong, you know, studio practice, experimentation. So
So for me, the big pieces were more, for me as the artist, the process of making them. And, you know, whether, I don't think the viewer necessarily got that, but, so for me, I learned a lot, which was the first time to work that large. It almost like informed ways that I want to approach paintings in the future. So I had done the gouaches, and I should have approached the beginning of the big paintings that same way and used that as like small studies. But I had a different idea of how to start, and thought that I wanted to like mask off the threads with like car pinstriping tape. That didn't work. Or marks that I made on or I was used to making on a small scale, I would step back and they were lost on that big scale. So what started as like a kind of like an underpainting, then grew to the final stages of I like completely sanded both pieces all the way down, and then started painting again, and then it turned into these like splatters, and then I started to see influences. When I started embroidering, there's only so many colors that exist, which was frustrating, because if I saw a color, I couldn't mix it, so I had to create the illusion of that color. So if I wanted a purplish, bluish green, I had to lay down purple and then dot it with blue and then dot it with green. So when I started these paintings, I found myself kind of dotting in certain areas, and then I wanted to accentuate, kind of let those embroideries really influence the painting, and discovered the accents that happen with the splatters, but they actually more kind of photorealistically represent the threads and what's happening. And then that final layer of like these dots that were put on with like a stencil and dried and then pulled off, so like there's these a little bit more three-dimensional dots that are on the top. So that was like the final layer, and then the piece was done. And so I feel like those choices and then the spray painting just gave me a lot of information for bigger pieces that I plan to do down the road. So.
And then tell me if I can ask a follow-up.
Mhm.
How your future interests translate to living and being an artist in St. Louis.
Did everyone hear that? Yeah, okay.
Can you?
How do your interests
Like-
translate to your future?
No.
Okay, you go ahead.
Because we were talking about being situated.
Yeah, mhm.
Quite a while when we started,
Mhm, mhm.
Now I'm trying to take what I think now was talking about,
Mhm.
was talking about psychology and growing as artists,
Mhm.
and see, now that we're looking at it from this perspective of yourself as an artist, how do you see that being influenced by being in St. Louis? Is it? You know, it's a challenge question.
I feel like for my work, I am very inspired by the architecture. Like the view out my studio window, my house is like 100 years old. I'm very inspired by the architecture of St. Louis. But I feel like my personal practice and the choices, even with these big paintings, is very much connected to, I'm a mom and I have 4 kids. So the choice to move from oil painting to the embroideries was a result of being pregnant and had to not be around turpentine and varnish, but it was also a perfect medium for me to be able to jump in and out of, because my studio time could no longer be 4-hour chunks. It had to be an hour here, hour there, and even choosing to work in acrylic, it was the same kind of thing. You know, my kids can come in and out of my studio, they can touch it, doesn't matter, they scratch it, I'm like, okay, that's another good scratch, you know. And so I feel like more than the city, I don't know, my practice is just very much influenced by being a mom. So.
Yeah, I mean, my practice is definitely influenced by the city, and I don't know, I don't think about it in that sense. I kind of just, I'm here while I'm here, and it works, and it just is working, and I feel inspired and supported, and that feels great. So I'm not really, I don't know. I'm not thinking about needing to leave or something.
Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for that really either. I would love some opportunities to go to a few other places and do some other things. And I've done some residencies in the past that have always really informed what I do here. So. I'm not sure, really.
Who else has a question for our panelists? Anyone? Matthew?
When you're thinking about your work, do you use the word narrative, or do you use the idea of narrative to guide your?
So it's a question about narrative and if it guides your practice.
I always sort of use the idea of narrative within putting together ideas for exhibitions, and but I use it really loosely and as a jumping off point and as sort of a guiding set of parameters. I don't think I've ever really made an exhibition that didn't have some sort of internal narrative component for me, and it's just dependent on how much I want to talk about that or how much I don't want to talk about that. And so like actually this is really the most sort of literary narrative that I've used for an exhibition. So yeah, I guess I always have a narrative. I don't know. I'm sorry, I lost my way in that thought.
But it also seems that this exhibition, it's very overt.
Yeah.
The relationship between this narrative to your work, to the exhibition itself.
Yeah.
Like it's pointed out from the beginning, and it's very specific.
Yep.
As opposed to kind of more thematic or,
Yeah.
conceptual in some way. A larger idea. It's a very specific story that
Right.
you're accessing.
I think for myself, while I'm making work, narrative isn't necessarily the forefront. It's more about kind of the experiential qualities. I think a lot about composition. I think a lot about action words. So, I have this thing and it looks like this and it does what. So I think a lot about the experience of it or the movement or the composition, like I said. I think in Abandoned Spaces, the narrative for me is about kind of this architectural skin and these building up of layers that aren't only physical, decorative, structural layers, but also psychological layers of a space and a place, and how, that changes over time through neglect, through abandonment, and just kind of what that does not only internally, but to our, collective community, landscape, but also like really taking nods to that transformation of a space into deterioration as this kind of ownership of the architecture to kind of just shed all this additional, all these layers, and the idea of having these layers that weren't all meant to be seen together, then exposed, and something that was private is now public, something that was, intimate within your domestic space is now more revealed. So I think as far as narrative, I think a lot about that, and then the narrative changed a little bit when it was about kind of transitioning from the contemporary from a clean space kind of into a more dilapidated space, and so depending.
I think for me, by choosing to only do friends and family, I'm kind of always coming from the same starting point, and I'm kind of looking like by the material that I'm using for the narrative to evolve when that viewer approaches the portrait and kind of what happens, because there's this one part that, well, why would someone want to see a portrait of my kid, or and so something happens either with the materiality of the work or starting to do these verso paintings, and I feel like it's I want the narrative to evolve like from that viewing.
I think we'll wrap it up there. So thank you very much to all of our panelists and our wonderful artists for all that you did in preparation for this exhibition, our jurors for being here today and coming back to have this conversation. Thank you so much, and thanks all of you for being here as well. Thank you.